Good afternoon. It is with great pleasure to welcome you at the second invited talk session of the Jean Monnet Chair in Risk and Crisis Communication in the EU. Today, we have the honor and privilege to discuss with Peter Schwartzstein about environmental risk communication. Peter Schwartzstein is an environmental journalist and consultant. He reports on issues about regional environment and geopolitics with emphasis on water resources in Middle East and North and East Africa. His work appears in National Geographic, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, and the BBC. He has also written articles in the New York Times, Bloomberg Business Week, The Guardian, Le Monde Diplomatique, and other outlets. He received grants from a number of organizations, including the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, the Rory Peck Trust, the Society for Environmental Journalists, and the Earth Journalism Network. He won first place in Society for Environmental Journalists 2016 awards for reporting on the environment in the bid large market. He was also selected as a TED Fellow in 2020. He is also a consultant for the UN Environment Program, and he conducts research and delivers reports as an independent consultant for the International Committee of the Red Cross, Amnesty International, United Nations Development Program, UNICEF, the International Water Management Institute, and other organizations. He is also a member of the Center for Climate and Security, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank. Environmental journalism has been characterized as one of the most dangerous beats in journalism, as journalists covering environmental issues face greater risks of arrest, threats, lawsuits, and harassment compared to journalists on other beats. Despite the dangers faced, environmental journalism is expected to inform and educate citizens, as well as to influence government policies and in turn improve the quality of the planet. Given the importance of environmental journalism, this lecture will help us better understand the practices used and the challenges faced by journalists when reporting on environmental issues. More specifically, Peter Schwartzstein will inform us on issues such as the mission of environmental journalism, the main practices used by environmental journalists, the challenges faced by journalists covering environmental issues, the role of new technologies in environmental journalism, the main frames used when covering environmental issues, as well as the impact of environmental journalism on governmental or international policy making on the environment. Peter Schwartzstein will help us delve inside the practice of environmental risk communication. Mr. Schwartzstein, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amalia, for that kind introduction. And thank you to everybody for coming along on a quite cold Wednesday evening. I've been staring at a screen since the early hours of the morning, so please forgive me if I stop making sense at any point. My eyes have gone slightly square from looking at the computer. And secondly, I mean, with these sorts of presentations, a lot of the time I find that they're more interesting for the audience and more interesting for the speaker if there's kind of an interactive component. So I'm going to speak for, I'm not quite sure how long it will take me, maybe 20 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer, maybe a little bit less. And then I would love to have a little bit of a back and forth with all of you, sort of answering whatever questions you might have. As Amalia said, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the importance of environmental journalism. I'm assuming, given that you've all tuned in this evening, that you're all basically convinced of its significance, but I'll elaborate a little bit more on that. I'll talk a little bit about the difficulties and challenges that we experience in kind of global environmental journalism, a little bit about how one goes about reporting as an environmental journalist, and then a little bit about the future of environmental journalism as a discipline. So there can be historically there was sort of a tendency to perhaps think of the environment as birds, as bees, as butterflies. And this is, to my mind, one of the biggest failures of the global environmental community over the last few decades is that we hadn't until recently done a very good job at showing that the environment is much more than that. The environment is the food we eat, the air we breathe, the water we drink. And even more than that, environment is infinitely and intimately tied up with jobs, particularly kind of those in rural areas, but also jobs beyond. It's tied up with healthcare, it's tied up with education, it's tied up with security. It's related to everything that we kind of place at the very top of our priority lists in our country. My particular area is called climate security, and climate security is the relationship between climate change and violence and instability. So I've spent most of the last 8 or 9 years working in different parts of the Middle East and Africa and South Asia, trying to show how climate stresses and climate shocks are contributing to conflict in places like Iraq and Syria and Sudan. Again, I'm assuming that because you're here, you don't need to be convinced of the importance of environmental coverage. However, just to sort of provide 1 or 2 examples to sort of reinforce the point, from about 2014 onwards, I spent a total of about 2 years over a 6-year-long period in parts of Iraq and Syria that had recently been liberated from ISIS, from the Islamic State group. And I found that in the villages that lacked supplementary irrigation, so that's villages that were dependent on rain and only rain, those villages were likely to have yielded about 3 times the number of fighters to ISIS as the villages that had access to river water or the villages that had access to groundwater. In other words, the villages that were completely reliant on rain and as a consequence had been damaged by drought to an extraordinary extent were significantly poorer and as a consequence seemingly particularly easy prey for ISIS recruiters when they came along from about 2012, 2013 onwards. I also found in a lot of you have, if you've heard of climate security, you've likely heard about it in the context of Syria. Now, according to the sort of the popular narrative prior to the revolution in Syria in 2011, fueled enormous migration from rural areas to urban areas. And in those kind of poor urban slum districts, a lot of those ex-farmers struggled to survive. And as a consequence, they were kind of particularly eager to rebel against a regime that was sort of notable for its brutality, notable for its extreme mismanagement. Now, that popular narrative is likely partly correct, but by reporting in Syria from about 2013, 2014 onwards, I was able to, along with many others, that narrative a little bit. So, for example, I found that kind of a lot of villagers who were used to corruption, they were used to kind of the government screwing them over and kind of, in the case of villagers who received seeds and fertilizer and other things from the state, they were used to kind of receiving kind of less quality and kind of less of these seeds and fertilizers than they expected. However, at a time when the drought was hitting harder and harder, and as a consequence, at a time when their profit margins were narrower and narrower, they were less tolerant of this corruption than they previously were. So that's just a brief example of how climate and security intersect, and as a consequence of kind of the extreme importance of focusing on the environment in journalistic terms. And then one final point on the importance. I started off as a political correspondent at Reuters, and then from about 2014 onwards, I gravitated into the environment. And that's not just because I was interested in environmental issues, it's also because environmental issues can be a brilliant kind of prism or lens through which to tell a wider story. So, for example, why does Iraq have water problems? Well, for the same reasons that Iraq has problems in general. It's the legacy of corruption. It's decades worth of mismanagement and poor governance. It's the consequence of years and years of conflict, and it's a consequence of poor treatment by both its neighbors and foreign powers. That's the reason why Iraq has water problems. That's the reason why Iraq has troubles in general. So even if you don't necessarily have a particular fascination with environmental affairs, and I'll talk a little bit later about why it can be perhaps problematic if you're not interested in it, but even if you don't, this is just a superb way of telling a wider story about a country's troubles. So how to go about this? Now, in most ways, environmental coverage is extremely similar, if not the same, as coverage in general, as journalism in general. A lot of the same rules apply. You seek as many different sources as you possibly can. You often over-report a story to a considerable extent. I mean, there's a journalistic maxim, which is that if you're a text writer, a print journalist, you often ought to have enough material to write an article 3 times longer than the one that you ultimately produce. You need kind of to hear from a whole range of sources, kind of, for example, even if you know what the kind of a government official in an authoritarian state is going to tell you, for the sake of balance, you still need to hear their thoughts, you still need to represent them within the article. And there are, I mean, a number of areas, however, where environmental journalism differs somewhat from other forms of media and other forms of coverage. One of them is that, and this is something that I believe Amalia was referencing earlier, environmental coverage can benefit from satellite imagery and remote sensing to an even greater extent than many other forms of journalism. So along with a few remote sensing experts, I've spent about 2 months in rural parts of Jordan back in about 2015, 2016, trying to identify the locations of illegal wells. Now, in the Jordanian context, that's particularly important because the country is one of the most water impoverished, one of the most water deprived countries in the world. And one of the reasons why the country's water problems are kind of going from bad to worse is that large amounts of the country's groundwater is getting depleted by illegal farming operations. So along with these remote sensing experts, we were able to examine kind of fields and different parts of agricultural land in Jordan to see where they were growing water intensive crops, to see where there were patches of greenery or crops that were not connected to legal wells, that were not connected to canal and irrigation networks. And as a consequence, we were able to build up quite an extensive, quite dramatic database showing where the kind of greatest intensity of illegal wells were and who was benefiting from them. And this can be particularly important because in environmental journalism, as in other forms of journalism, you're not always granted the kind of access that you require. And so if you can turn to satellite imagery, if you can turn to remote sensing, that can at least partly compensate for that inability to reach these areas on the ground. Another area where environmental journalism is perhaps a little bit different to other forms of media is the kind of importance and the power of interactive media packages. So I mostly, in the past, not quite so much now, but in the past, I mostly worked for National Geographic. And when I worked, I was almost always working in tandem with a photographer and a videographer. Because if you're trying to illustrate to a wide audience the dangers of environmental degradation or the power of climate change, you often need photographs. You need video footage to accompany the text, because it's only that way, perhaps, that you can sort of impress upon the reader, impress upon the viewer, the kind of gravity of the situation. I mentioned that it can be sort of problematic. I mean, as in most parts of life, if you're not interested in your particular beat, it can be significantly more difficult. And I would argue that in climate and environmental security, the kind of subfield of environmental journalism that I work in, but also environmental journalism in general, a lot of the time you are kind of placing a lot of faith in the knowledge and the experience and the expertise of the journalist. And that's because you do often lack the you do often lack some background noise there, I think. If you do often lack the access that you need on the ground, you do often lack the data that you require to sort of really make a forceful case. And in those instances, it falls to you as the journalist to fill in the gaps. It falls to you as the journalist to use your judgment to make a conclusion that is not always completely borne out by the data that you have at hand. And as a consequence, it's arguably even more important in a field like environmental journalism than it is in journalism in general for the journalist to have amassed a considerable body of experience and knowledge over an extended period. The thing that I want are the challenges and difficulties. And I would say these fall under about 4 different categories. The first one is avert persecution. Amalia mentioned at the beginning that environmental journalists face an extraordinary number of threats. Now, Global Witness, which is a London-based NGO, has found that every year for the last 10 years or so, the number of environmental defenders that are being killed is increasing, and we're hitting kind of numbers that are significantly greater than ever before, with a particular focus on environmental activists and environmental defenders getting killed in Latin America and South Asia and Southeast Asia. Now that's environmental defenders in general. However, environmental journalists face many of those same threats. And I would argue that part of this is down to climate change. As climate change hits harder and harder, more governments, particularly in authoritarian states, are recognizing the destabilizing potential of climate change. They are seeing how climate change can bring together different opposition groups. They're seeing how it can be an issue which can unite groups of people who perhaps can't agree on anything else. So Iran is a horribly prescient example of this phenomenon. Like, until about 4 or 5 years ago, environmental journalists and environmental activists could report on environmental issues in ways that human rights defenders and human rights focused journalists couldn't ever dream of. And yet, as climate change began to hit the country harder, and as the water situation worsened, the government became aware of how Islamists and secularists, liberals and conservatives were collectively bonding over their kind of shared opposition to the state's water policy. And as a consequence, my Iranian journalist friends have found that as of the last 4 or 5 years, water is about as sensitive a topic as one could possibly find. Now, this is certainly true of kind of crackdowns at the hands of governments, but this is arguably also true because we are seeing a lot more in the way of corporate and business kind of attacks on environmental journalists than we were previously. So, for example, in rural parts of Brazil, a lot of my environmental journalist colleagues are coming under either physical attacks or legal attacks from agribusinesses and loggers and miners in a way that they weren't previously. And quite why that's happening is something of a mystery. In some places, it seems that some of these kind of extractive industries are less convinced of the kind of state's willingness to protect them, and as a consequence, they're taking events into their own hands. In other instances, I mean, the way that a Peruvian environmental journalist colleague expressed it to me, she feels that the logging sector in Peru is kind of, we use the phrase in English, making hay while the sun still shines, sort of taking advantage of positive economic circumstances, which as far as they're concerned are not going to last. And this kind of crackdown on environmental journalists at the hands of both governments and corporations is particularly dangerous and particularly deadly for journalists who work in rural areas or small towns. So if you look at environmental journalists who've been killed or attacked or targeted in the line of duty, the vast majority of them have been those who work in small towns for small publications or small TV channels in parts of India, parts of Pakistan, parts of Bangladesh, parts of Mexico, parts of Brazil. And that's because they have there's less accountability among many of the local authorities who are targeting them. In many instances, there's also there are fewer NGOs or fewer media freedom organizations to sort of focus on their plight. And in many instances, they're just more vulnerable because they have, I mean, their families live at kind of within these relevant areas, and so threats can just be that bit more potent. And then you have the funding issue. Now, as all of you are undoubtedly aware, like the business model for global media is basically broken, and this is every bit as true of environmental journalism as it is of media in general. But for environmental journalism, this is arguably particularly problematic because environmental investigations can require a lot more funding and a lot more money than other investigations. A lot of the worst environmental abuses and a lot of the worst manifestations of climate change are playing out in kind of rural, isolated, and like hard to access areas. And in order to work in these areas, you often need a lot of fuel for cars. If it's a country in which you don't speak the language, you need translation. You just need an awful lot of time in order to kind of effectively report. And the more time it requires, often the more money that it's required. And so when you have kind of financial requirements as large as those that many environmental investigations require, it can be particularly hard to persuade newspaper bosses or TV bosses of the need to kind of dedicate some of their scarce budget to this particular beat. And then I'll just kind of hit on maybe two more kind of challenges before briefly talking about some of the ways in which environmental journalism is changing. And so one of them is the difficulty of making environmental journalism kind of compelling, like as interesting and kind of displaying how important it is, even when editors really need much convincing themselves. And that's because if you lack the access to a lot of the areas where a lot of the worst environmental and climate abuses are playing out, if you're unable to secure a lot of the data that can make an environmental investigation particularly compelling, then it can be hard to really lay out in a 2-minute TV clip or an 800-word newspaper article quite how severe and important the situation is. And then one more challenge of a very different sort. So a lot of my editors at National Geographic over the last decade have frequently told me that my stories are too depressing, they're too dispiriting. And my response to that has often been, well, what I work on is extremely dispiriting and extremely depressing. Like, what am I supposed to do about that? The problem is that even when you have magazine readers, newspaper readers, TV viewers who are 100% convinced of the dangers of climate change and of the importance of environmental action, that doesn't mean that they want to be depressed on a kind of day-to-day basis by the news that you are kind of getting across to them. And so when you have an environment and climate story that just doesn't have a good news angle, it can be hard after a while to persuade editors of the importance of placing it somewhere prominent in this instance in the magazine. And then, so how are things changing? Well, in a Western media context, for the record, I'm half American, half British, and mostly work for a combination of media in those two countries. In these places, environmental coverage has changed dramatically in the last few years. Like, until a few years ago, journalists covering environmental or climate issues were often scrambling and fighting for a kind of a small column on page 23 of the New York Times. The situation is extremely different now. Climate change and environment-related stories very often appear on page 1. That's great. However, a lot of that kind of interest, a lot of that progress is not necessarily being translated into media coverage or environmental media coverage in other parts of the world. Now, that's not because people in other parts of the world are necessarily less interested in climate change or environmental issues. It's not because they're less convinced of its importance. But when you have so many other problems, so for example, in a Middle Eastern context, when you have conflict, when you have financial crises, it can be very, very hard to persuade both people in general and kind of newspaper and media bosses of the need to prioritize environment and climate issues. Now, as I said at the very beginning, part of that is a failure on the part of the environmental community to show how our issue, environment and climate, is related to the issues that are prioritized: security, economy, health, education. But there still needs to be a lot of work done to emphasize that. And then finally, I mean, I said there's been a lot of progress in American and Western European media coverage of the environment over the last decade, and that's certainly true. However, we are seeing one perhaps negative thing, which is that in the US in particular, climate change is becoming an even more sort of politically polarizing issue than it previously was. So even though you have less overt climate denial than you previously did, because I mean, it's just harder than ever to deny the reality of climate change, it's more often than not in some media circles being presented in terms that are not necessarily particularly useful or necessarily particularly accurate. You've heard me rambling on perhaps long enough now. Amalia, should we turn to some questions and answers? Does that make sense? You're on mute.
Sorry. Okay, we can proceed to the questions. I would like to thank you once again for the enlightening and interesting presentation. You have shed light on a neglected area of journalism compared to the rest of the media landscape. Now let's give a warm applause to our speaker. Okay. Now, let's move on to the discussion session. Is there anyone from the audience that would like to pose a question to Mr. Schwartzstein or the online audience? Please raise your hand. Konstantinos would like to address a question. Would you like to come here? Το μικρόφωνο δεν. Where's the microphone? Where's Παναγιώτα? Παναγιώτα, the microphone. Come here. Έλα, πάμε σε. Δεν θες να σε δει? Όχι. Έλα, εντάξει. Εδώ κοντά τουλάχιστον. Here. Από κάτω.
Hi. I would like to ask if you can tell us a bit more about how you started, some important turning points in your career development, and if you're planning it for the future.
I can't really hear you.
Okay, one more time. Here.
Hi.
Loud.
I wanted to ask if you can tell us a bit more about how you started, and if you can tell us a bit more about if you can tell us some important turning points in your professional development, and if you're planning anything for the future, what more are you trying to do? Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, I started as a trainee at Reuters in London. So the four big wires agencies, Reuters, AP, AFP, and Bloomberg, almost all of them provide annual traineeships for aspiring journalists. Now they're quite competitive to get, but they're a kind of a real baptism of fire. The idea is that they kind of throw you from desk to desk. So from macroeconomics to politics and general news to transport and infrastructure, just for you to understand how different kinds of journalism work, and for them to decide whether they like the idea of hiring you on a permanent basis. So I started as a trainee at Reuters in London back in 2012. And I very soon decided that, and I think they decided as well, that this was not the best fit. They put me on the macroeconomics desk, and even after 3 or 4 months, I still didn't really understand what was going on. So at the beginning of 2013, I moved to Egypt in order to learn Arabic, and in order to sort of begin focusing on kind of the, I guess, slightly less happy consequences that emerged out of the Arab Spring. So one of the things that I frequently say to sort of young journalists or aspiring journalists when they come to me is sort of learn a useful language and move somewhere which is at the heart of the news cycle. Back in 2013, Egypt and the Middle East very much was. As for kind of to answer your, or try and answer your question about kind of big turning points.
Yeah.
So I was trying to think the other day what it was about the environment that kind of first shifted me in that kind of direction. And part of it was what I mentioned earlier about seeing environment and water issues as like really useful like lenses through which to tell bigger stories. But I'm not sure again that there was a precise eureka moment, but back in 2015, I was reporting in the far south of Iraq. And the far south of Iraq is disgustingly hot in the middle of summer. It can be up to 50, 52 Celsius with very high humidity as well. And I was interviewing a young man, a farmer, and I was asking him about how he and his family survived in temperatures that high, like weather conditions that inhospitable. And his answer was, well, we don't survive. And he took me along to the house of his grandfather, who was about 85 years old. And the man kind of sat in his, or lay in his bed, struggling to breathe in the extremely hot weather conditions. And this farmer, this young man who I'd been interviewing, called me after I had left this little village to say that his grandfather had died. from a heart attack that was seemingly made more likely by the extreme temperature conditions. So it really hammered home to me just how like unbelievably dangerous and deadly kind of climate change and general environmental issues can be. Yeah, I hope that's a helpful-ish response.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Konstantinos. Another question we have from Nikolaos.
What is his academic background? It takes prior knowledge in environmental science to become an environmental scientist.
Okay, Nikolaos is asking, what is your educational background, academic background, yes, and whether you have taken courses on environmental science? Is this the question?
Yes.
If you have prior knowledge on environmental science.
Good question. No, so I studied political science at undergraduate, and I studied international relations for my master's. I did work at a student newspaper for much of my time at university. However, no, I had no academic or scholarly background in environmental science. And at the beginning, when I kind of moved from political reporting into environmental reporting, that made my work extremely challenging. It meant that I 2 or 3 times longer, perhaps, to write an environmental story as I would a political story, because I was double checking, triple checking everything with experts to make sure that I wasn't saying anything stupid. I was doing an enormous amount of extra reading again. But every year or every month that I worked in environmental journalism, the more that my understanding of the kind of underlying science grew. So even though I still have no academic or scholarly background in environmental science, I've worked on a lot of these issues for long enough to feel that I have a strong understanding of most of the key parts, the key parts that are relevant to the areas of environment and climate that I work on. But more importantly, that I have a strong understanding of what I don't know. And as a consequence, I know when I have to sort of turn to real experts and when I can make certain judgments myself.
Thank you. Okay, Alexia Angelidis is asking if you have noticed differences in environmental crisis communication depending on the cultural context of each country.
That's a good question. So again, most of my work has been in the Middle East and North and East Africa, and these are mostly very religious, socially conservative countries. And as a consequence, some of the people within these countries who carry the greatest weight and whose voices are most powerful are religious figures. So in Jordan, which is one of the most, as you know, one of the most water impoverished countries in the world, the average Jordanian receives about 1/3 of what the United Nations considers to be the most basic kind of water requirement per person. In these places, imams, sort of Muslim religious figures, have been some of the most effective figures in preaching water conservation, in pushing people to save water wherever they can. So again, that's not something that's exclusive to kind of Muslim majority parts of the world. I've also worked a lot in Christian majority parts of West Africa. And a lot of these places, again, it falls to priests to do a lot of the kind of the most important work in counseling against deforestation, because they are the figures within communities that that are just seen as being most important. Yeah, I don't know. That was the first thing that leapt to mind. I will have a broader answer to your question.
Thank you. Another question? Do we have any questions? No. The online audience?
You please ask Peter
Okay.
how covering environmental rights affects him psychologically,
Okay.
and how he combats with these feelings that may generate the crisis. We say that generally become.
You can come here and. Professor.
Hi, Peter.
Hi.
I'm not sure that you have mentioned your status, if you are a freelancer or you work for Medium now, but we research about the effect on journalists covering crisis, multiple crises like economic crisis or health crisis. Now we face environmental crisis. So does this coverage affect you psychologically, and which way you combat with these effects?
Thank you. So I was previously a staffer at National Geographic for a few years. Now I'm freelance because I've made the very stupid decision to write a book about climate security. So that's commanding all of my time and any question. Covering environmental issues can be extremely depressing, and it can be in some ways traumatic. Now, the reality is the more that you cover horrible stuff, the easier it can become, because you develop, you become a little bit callous, you become a little bit good to some of the problems, but you also develop your own coping mechanisms. You understand better what will affect you in a traumatizing way and what will not. You learn kind of when you need to sort of talk to your partner or talk to your friends about kind of some of the horrible things you've seen, or when perhaps everything is okay. But no, I mean, I mentioned earlier this experience in southern Iraq. I mean, I've had two kinds of maybe traumatic experience, the kind of the obvious and the less obvious. I mean, I've had 2 or 3 kidnapping attempts on me in Iraq and Syria over the last few years. And those were terrifying. And for periods afterwards, I would kind of wake up having nightmares in the middle of the night. But then there's the kind of the less obvious ones, which is the kind of the sense of, I mean, people in most of the Middle East and most of Africa, they're used to droughts. They're used to extreme weather events. They're used to high temperatures, but they're not used to droughts coming this frequently or this severely. They're used to high temperatures, but they're not used to temperatures that are quite as high as this, or temperatures that are lasting as long as that. And so when you see these old men, these sort of 80, 85-year-old men who are just lost because everything they've ever known is changing in front of their eyes, like that's something that kind of affects you. You just see that kind of that sadness and that kind of extreme dislocation in their eyes, and that can be difficult to manage. So I mean, there's something called the DART Center for Journalism Trauma at Columbia University, because, and you imagine you may be extremely aware of this, because there's this growing understanding that environmental journalism is every bit as traumatic an experience as covering conflict in some scenarios. So yeah, I'm glad you asked that.
just briefly to take the advance and ask one, do you find help, support to your working environment, to your colleagues, or is there a direction that the academic institutes should take to prepare to support the coming journalists?
So when I first kind of experienced, I mean, as I said, I started as a political correspondent covering some of the massacres and some of the conflicts in the Middle East from 2012 onwards. So I maybe had a little bit more experience of trauma than many other people within the environmental journalism field. However, I think a lot of the time it's trial and error. Like you only understand that you're not okay when things get pretty bad. Particularly among male journalists, there can be an unfortunate tendency to try and sort of ignore these problems and hope that they disappear. But when I first started as a journalist, I mean, not that long ago, but 10 years ago, there were many fewer resources available to journalists, particularly environmental journalists who are experiencing troubles. With the emergence of the Dark Center and a few of these other organizations, there are many more possibilities than there previously were. And many of them are available for freelancers as well. So that's an extremely positive development. But ultimately, in journalism, in environmental journalism, as in so many other non-media professions, a lot of the time it's your family and your social circle who you turn to for support. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have a lot to ask, but okay. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. I think Professor Mikhail would like to ask a question.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for being here with us. I'm an anthropologist, and I could not avoid making a question on indigenous practices and how far you have noticed that these practices have been interfered with capitalist practices in the modern world. And another question has to do with, we know that the production practices have long exceeded the capacity of the environment in many areas. For example, we see what happens in the Amazon, we see what happens in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world, in Africa. So, although it has been made very clear to us what you have suggested, that environmental issues are very strictly connected to political issues, this is very well understood. But what is important is that environmental issues have always been the case, even when Western people did not make their presence visible in indigenous areas. The thing is that the way Western countries have used the resources has made the difference here, and that indigenous practices have never actually been given much attention. They have been recorded. We know, for example, the rotation agricultural system of the Aboriginals, of the Aborigines in the Amazon. We know how controlled fires were controlling the environment in Australia. We know all these traditional indigenous practices that haven't been given the attention that they should be given, I believe. So what have you recorded so far in relation to this kind of issue?
Thank you. I mean, one small caveat first, which is that, as I said, I mostly work on climate security, and the nature of climate security is that it's a mostly new field over the last 20 or 30 years. However, I did spend a lot of last year working on a National Geographic story looking at whether mud brick construction, like a return to traditional construction techniques, could be a partial way of managing more extreme heat in parts of the world that are already extremely hot, like the Sahel and different parts of North and West Africa. And even though this was not my area of expertise in the slightest, and so I had a bit of an empty mind, a bit of a blank slate. And I came away certainly understanding the power and the importance of a lot of these indigenous climate coping techniques, building with mud brick, which of course is a material which is better suited to hot climates than concrete. The importance in agriculture of, I don't know, planting your crops under canopies of trees, et cetera, et cetera. And in the Middle East, particularly in Iran and Iraq, Édras, which are these kind of water distribution networks, which are extremely sustainable and also kind of one of the best ways of preserving what little water is still falling. So I have a significantly greater understanding of the usefulness and of the importance of indigenous coping techniques than I previously did. And it's, as you said, certainly a tremendous shame that many of them have been abandoned. However, in many instances, it was the communities themselves that abandoned a lot of their indigenous coping techniques. And that's because a lot of them have, again, I'm painting indigenous coping techniques with an extremely broad brush. It's very hard to generalize. But a lot of them have been excessively romanticized. So for example, at the same time as mud brick construction is more important than ever in facing hot temperatures, it's also more vulnerable than ever to the fiercer rainfall and the kind of more intense floods that a lot of these same communities are experiencing. So a lot of the time, and this is I guess my very unsatisfying conclusion, a lot of the time the answer is kind of a combination of a lot of these indigenous techniques which are useful, but maybe only useful up to a point, along with kind of a lot of the more modern techniques that that communities have often elected to use. No, I completely agree with most of what you say. It's just a question now of making the most of a bad situation.
Obviously, also because these techniques were meant to support smaller communities and not to support big companies to massively produce meat for the fast food industry of North America, for example. That's the main reason why the Amazon has been destroyed. Okay.
Yeah.
Deforestation is mainly due to, I believe, is mainly due to the production of beef for the industry, the fast food industry of America. So politics, economics, the environment, they're all connected, of course. And definitely indigenous practices are not could not possibly support this sort of production, massive production of food and other products. Thank you.
Agreed. Yeah, no, the last thing I was going to say to that is a lot of the time in the kind of Western environmental community, there can be a desire to focus on population growth, which in itself is not particularly accurate. Like, this world seemingly can support the kind of 8 billion or so people that we do have. The problem is it cannot support 8 billion people who, as you said, insist on eating meat with the frequency that we currently do, that insist on treating our natural habitats with the disdain that we currently do. So it's not so much the size of the global population that's problematic. It's, as you said, the extremely unsustainable habits.
Exactly.
More and more of us are developing. Yeah.
Thank you.
So the greediness of modern people are basically responsible for the climate crisis. It's not change anymore, it's crisis. It was changed 4 decades ago. Now it's crisis. And we should change our attitude towards the environment and the way we produce and the way that we treat our resources. This is the meaning. And of course, it has to do with politics, as you said. Thank you very much.
Agreed.
Thank you. We have 2 questions from Panagiotis Preventis about environmental discourse and whether you could propose 3 steps, at least 3 steps, for making communication on environmental issues and transboundary crisis effective.
Okay. It might take me a little bit of time to think of a truly coherent 3-step process when it comes to transboundary crises. I'll perhaps try and answer that question. I know this is probably not the precise question that Panagiotis is asking, but I'll try and answer that question through the prism of the Nile Basin water dispute, which is an issue that I've got over the past decade. I mean, a lot of you are likely aware that Ethiopia has been building this extremely large dam near the source of the Blue Nile for the past 9 years or so. And this has been an extraordinary sort of source of unhappiness in Egypt, which feels threatened by the dam and which feels that its own share of the water will be reduced as a consequence. However, a lot of the toxicity or a lot of the tension in the clash has been reduced. And it's been reduced in part because there is an understanding, or at least a partial understanding among everybody within the Nile Basin, that they face greater threats than the dam. They face the challenge of climate change, of course, but they also face the damage from pollution. I mean, as I was discussing previously with this, the challenges from environmental degradation can be every bit as severe, and in many instances more severe than climate change itself. And within the Nile Basin, there is, I think, a growing realization that their enemy is more potent than a single dam, and that if they're to ultimately have enough water for everybody within the basin to enjoy life on a kind of sustainable and dignified basis, then they need to focus on much greater long-term perils than a single dam. But no, I haven't really answered your 3-step question there. I'll try and put a little additional thought into that one.
Okay. And the second question is about the uprising environmental activism at the art museums. Do you think that environmental activism of this form is moving public opinion towards common sense, or is it marginalizing, or is it marginalizing the environmental activism discourse?
That's a good question, and one that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. I mean, as I imagine most people within this talk have seen, there have been a number of very publicized protests by anti-oil, sort of anti-fossil fuel activists at European and American museums and art galleries over the last few months. I mean, it's one of these in which I feel I can see both sides, and I've yet to fully decide kind of which side if you think of these protests as an exercise in winning hearts and minds, well, in that instance, they look to be an enormous failure. They've generated an extraordinary amount of negative coverage among many people who need to be convinced, kind of the average man or woman on the street. There's also the negative thing, which is I think the average person believes that these protests have actually inflicted a lot more damage on the pieces of art in the museums than they actually. So at the protests in London and Amsterdam, in Berlin, from what I understand, the activists didn't actually permanently damage the pieces of art. They threw paint at the frames of the paintings and at the kind of glass coverings on top of the paintings. However, if you look at a lot of the news coverage, those kind of facts have not necessarily got through to the average reader, and as a consequence, I think the coverage has been more negative than one might appreciate. However, on the other side, as I said, I've yet to fully understand where I personally sit on this debate. There is quite a lot of sort of scholarly evidence to suggest that even if the coverage is negative, and again, the coverage has mostly been extremely negative of these protests, that just by getting the issue out there for an extended period, that can lead to superior outcomes in the future. So, for example, the UK experienced a lot of anti-fossil fuel protests last year, some of which were done in a slightly crazy way. Like you had all these activists kind of gluing their hands to the sides of trains, which one would imagine was sending a slightly strange signal, given that trains and mass transit will be an extremely important part of a kind of decarbonized future. However, a lot of scholars looked at sort of attitudes towards net zero, attitudes towards a kind of lower carbon future in the aftermath of these protests, and found that people were engaging on the topic in ways that they never previously were. So I can see both sides, and I'm not sure yet where to stand. But I do perhaps feel that some of these protests could be conducted in a slightly smarter way, even if, of course, I 100% agree with the rationale behind them.
Okay, and the question from Sofia Michalatu: how does the environmental crisis affect politics in Europe and worldwide, and how will Europe is affected by climate change?
That's a very big question. I don't really know where to start. I mean, on the one hand, you could argue that European politics has already been massively affected by, or indirectly affected by, environmental issues. I don't want to overstate, I don't want to kind of exaggerate climate change and environment's contribution to the migration crisis across the Mediterranean. I mean, the people who are leaving parts of the Middle East and parts of Africa and parts of South Asia to travel to Europe have many, many different motivations, many of which have nothing to do with climate change and the environment. However, I've done a lot of work in different parts of the Sahel, which is this kind of part of Africa just to the south of the Sahara that's getting hit very, very hard by climate change. And when you ask them why they are leaving to try and get to Europe, why their brothers, their sisters, their cousins are leaving to try and get to Europe, climate change, directly or indirectly, frequently comes up as one of the answers. And if you look at the ways in which European politics has been affected by the so-called refugee and migration crisis over the last decade, it's a pretty tremendous impact that one can imagine will only grow in the future. So that's one very small part of the contribution. I mean, there are many other ways in which climate and environment have likely already affected European politics, both at a continent-wide level and within individual countries. And there are many other ways in which that impact will likely be magnified in the future. But yeah, that's a question that needs an entire talk of its own just to scratch the surface.
Okay, and the last question from me, because we're the Department of Communication and Digital Media, I would like to ask you, what is the role of new technologies in environmental journalism, and whether it affects your practices and the way you operate?
Thank you. So I briefly touched earlier on the usefulness and the importance of satellite imagery, remote sensing technology, which has been a complete game changer for many journalists, many environmental journalists who just can't get permission to access a lot of the areas that they need and want to report on. So that's one. A second, drones, of course. Now, drones can provide a similarly useful way of illustrating environmental damage at a time when the ground is perhaps inaccessible and or too dangerous. As I said, I spent a lot of time working in kind of remote, isolated parts of Iraq to try and better understand how ISIS benefited from collapsing conditions in agricultural areas to recruit fighters. And a lot of the time I was working with a videographer who used a drone because some areas, even 300 meters away from where we were simply too dangerous for us to actually visit on foot. So drones. But again, there's, as with satellite imagery, which often requires what's called ground validation, kind of people later visiting the ground in order to verify what you've seen online. Drones come with many of their own pitfalls as well. I mean, it's illegal to even bring a drone into dozens and dozens of countries. And even if you can bring a drone in, there are often extraordinary limitations placed on its use. So all of that is a long way of saying that technology has been an extraordinary asset in journalism, particularly environmental journalism, but it can only ever be an addition to accompany a lot of the kind of traditional journalism techniques that my colleagues have used going back decades.
Okay, thank you. Once again, I would like to express my gratitude and thanks for this wonderful speech and for all the insights that you have provided us. Thank you again. It was a wonderful lecture. I think we all enjoyed it. Thank you all for your participation. And we have another question from Professor Mikhail. I think I
just wanted to ask something very briefly. Have you ever felt like an activist doing environmental journalism?
Yes and no. I mean, for the most part, it's quite important to have a distinction between journalism and activism. At the same time, when you have a force as negative as environmental degradation or as negative as climate change, it's not as if you are impartial. It's not as if you are indifferent to the outcome of the investigation that you're working on. And so I've often felt that perhaps I have, and I think this would probably be true of most people within environmental journalism, you have a little bit of an activist mindset, but you try very, very hard to make sure that you don't use activist techniques, and you try very hard to ensure that that activist mindset does not lead to kind of an activist outcome. But no, that's a constant battle, and it's a potential danger that we all try and remain very sort of alive to.
Yes, definitely.
And the last question from Professor Kleftodimos. The last question.
Yeah, the last. Thank you very much for your talk. I would like to ask if there's anything that makes you optimistic on whether the world in the end will manage to tackle these global environmental issues. We see like a global issue like the climate change, and we see countries don't have the capacity to cooperate to solve this problem, which probably, I don't know, it requires some global I don't know, I wouldn't say
agreement
governance, but some global agreements that there are probably some goals, but we see countries that cannot cooperate to reach these goals. And then you have like other issues that countries like Greece set goals, but then like Greece was committed to reduce fossil fuel, and then we have like the Russian-Ukrainian war that and the energy crisis, and Greece goes back and uses fossil fuel extensively. So are you optimistic about this whole situation?
It is, yeah. There's the short answer and the long answer. The short answer is that I feel we have no choice but to be optimistic, because if we kind of allow ourselves to surrender to the pessimism, the understandable pessimism, as you say, but if you surrender to the pessimism, it just becomes a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, whereby you kind of start acting in ways which ensure that the negative outcome is more likely. So that's the very short response. The longer one is that there is a lot, even amid the many challenges, some of which you mentioned, there are a lot of sources of optimism. So if you looked back 5 or 10 years ago, it would have been quite hard to imagine the amount of progress that we have had. Like, global emissions are, in some key states, like a lot of like the US and much of Western Europe, emissions are falling at a pretty impressive speed. Now, again, it's not happening quick enough, but it's happening a lot faster than we previously imagined, and it's ensured that a lot of the worst case warming scenarios are probably off the table. Like, the world is most likely not going to warm by 2.5 Celsius. Now, even 2 Celsius is devastating, but I don't know, if we're looking for optimism, it's not 2.5. Secondly, I do agree with you about the lack of cooperation. However, there's more cooperation happening than I think some people appreciate. So as I said, the Middle East is where I've done much of my work. I was based in Egypt for about 6.5 years, and I continue to work there for much of my year. And yet, despite the fact that this is a very complicated region with a lot of authoritarian regimes and a huge amount of kind of ongoing and past conflict, there's still a lot more cross-border water and environment and climate cooperation than is necessarily understood. So recently, and just to give you one example, Israel and Jordan signed an agreement to transfer solar energy from Jordan to Israel and desalinated water from Israel to Jordan. Egypt and Saudi Arabia are exploring producing green hydrogen on an industrial scale. Again, none of this is enough. None of it is close to enough. But if a region as complicated as the Middle East can start to display that amount of cooperation, then I regard that as a real source of encouragement in the long run. So anyway, that's another question that I would love to talk to you about at greater length, but that can wait for next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now I think our lecture has come to the end. I would like another warm applause.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for your participation. That's all. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, everybody. Nice to meet you. Thank you for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.